Hello everyone, and a really warm welcome to the afternoon session, our final session on these animal health workshops that we're doing today. We've covered so many different subjects, and now we're moving on to talking about AMR and antimicrobial benchmarking. So I'm Di Wastnage, if you've not met me before, Vice Chair of ROBDF, and I shall be chairing this section for you. What we'd love to do is ask lots of questions too, so please do put them in the chat box and we'll redirect them to the speaker at the end. We're looking really for about 50 minutes, so do give us quite a few questions for him and really challenge him. That'd be really interesting. So also a bit of housekeeping. If you can keep your computers on mute, stop your videos, that'd be great. If you're using Twitter, please use the hashtag #DairyTech, which would be great. And also, I think we've just got to thank our sponsors, which is Vet Partners, for this session. So I'd now like to introduce you to Dr. Tim Potter. Welcome to our virtual conference, Tim. West Point Vets was where you started. I know you did a PhD in antimicrobials, and you really do focus on young stock health management and providing advice to sort of calf rearing units across the UK. Where should we start, Tim? Are you ready?
Yeah, I'm just waiting for the slides to come up.
Perfect. I can't see you at all. Lovely.
That's perfect.
Great. Tim, the floor's all yours.
Thank you very much for the introduction, Di. I would turn on my video, but unfortunately, I think I need Carrie to do it. The purpose of the session, I think, was just to sort of start talking about antimicrobial benchmarking, and I think we've got a lot of initiatives working out there in the industry at the moment, doing a lot of great work to promote good practice around antimicrobial usage, driving it down and sort of going forward with that sort of One Health approach. And it's about trying to look at, right, what does that mean on an individual farm level? Because I think sometimes it's a sort of great, we're at the industry, it's like, what can people be doing at farm level and how does that benchmarking work for them? So in terms of overview, what I want to do is do a quick introduction onto the sort of the topic. We'll have a little bit of a look at antimicrobial resistance and its impact, where we are as an industry, current updates, and then looking at how we then take that onto the farm. And as you said, Di, happy to have some conversation at the end with questions and things at that stage. So in terms of sort of medicines on farm, just want to sort of be clear about what we're talking about. There's ultimately lots of different medicines on farm: anti-inflammatories, the other painkillers, multivitamins, reproductive hormones, antiparasitics, and the antimicrobials. And those sort of, that's the class that we're really going to focus on. I think you can take a lot of the principles that we're putting in place here about when you're looking at medicine usage on farm, and as a vet, certainly what I do with a lot of my clients is going, well, actually, yeah, we do antimicrobial benchmarking, but we will benchmark on all these medicines because actually they give us a huge amount of information about what goes on a farm on a day-to-day basis. In the same way that we use diagnostic testings to screen for disease, actually what people are doing in terms of their medicine usage is gives us a good surrogate marker of it. So it allows us to understand what steps we're taking. And in some ways, if you want to put it down to pound, shilling, pence, it's about the financial spend that's going on in terms of, right, I'm managing my herd. What am I spending on fertility drugs? What am I spending on wormers? And I think that's going to be another area of great focus as we go back about sort of the environmental impact and sort of long-term responsible use. But it just gives a great way of sort of a quite quick insight into how your farm is working and taking it back to financials, and then how we can take steps to improve things. So I suppose what we do within that, we're looking at those medicines that treat disease, and that's what we're really focusing on about today, those antibiotics. As I said, same principles would apply for antiparasitics. And also when you start to think about it, think about what's going on in terms of vaccines and benchmarking around there. What are antibiotics and why are they important? Ultimately, what we're talking about is either naturally occurring or synthetic substances which inhibit or destroy the bacteria. They're important both in veterinary and human medicine, and I suppose that's where some of this sort of, we get this cross industry interest in this area. And I think that's where some of the sort of the politics come into it, because it's not just about what we're doing on farm, it's about what the doctors are doing in hospitals, GPs are doing out in the community. And it's all about, we went through a stage a few years back of mudslinging, especially between the medics and the vets, about turning around and go, it's all about what doctors are doing, and doctors turning around and say it's all about what vets are doing on farm. And I think luckily we've moved on from that, and it's now embracing this joined up approach to it. In veterinary medicine, we're interested in these products, and they're an essential part of us promoting health, welfare, productivity, and food safety. And then, of course, in human medicine, health, well-being, increasing that life expectancy, ability to treat common infections. And then when we go into sort of real resistance, and the concerns come in about actually it's people's ability to perform those routine surgical procedures, which modern medicine has allowed us to do. And I suppose the focus is, and I think the reminder is always out there, it's remember antibiotics don't work for everything. And it's about agreeing treatment protocols with your vet and going through and making sure that actually don't always reach for the antibiotics, because there are certain conditions they won't be appropriate for. And I think that always has to underline your principles of treatment on farm. So there are lots of different antibiotics out there. We spend a lot of time as vets learning all about the different families of antibiotics, and this is not a talk on pharmacology, but it just puts into perspective. And I know it gets very confusing because we have the names that everyone's familiar in terms of the products on farm, and then they all fall into certain categories, and which sort of, that's where it's that sort of extra level and where they fit. And I suppose with the regulations and changing expectations about what products are used where, it's making sure that you're aware of where some of the products fit, making sure that's a point of discussion with your vets, especially around milk contracts and things like that, where certain products and certain are wanting to be kept out by certain suppliers. So it's making sure that you're always aware of that, and same for farm assurance. But lots of different families, they all work in slightly different ways, or they have slightly different characteristics, and that's why we choose them. And so it's a sort of, but there's a lot of overlap in terms of where they will be effective. But it's a sort of make sure that you're having that conversation around that with your vet. More recently, there's lots of different ways of categorizing them. We can look in, so those families, the European Medicines Agency more recently looked at sort of categorizing them in terms of this category A, B, C, and D, about how we should be approaching them and how vets should be prescribing them on farm. We have the ones in red there, which very much those category A products that we should be avoiding and ultimately shouldn't be used in farm at all. We have category B, which is slightly lower down that sort of risk rating. We can potentially use them. These are frequently those ones referred to as a high priority, critically important antibiotics. And then moving down, ones that should be used with caution, and then ones that should be prudence. In some ways, I suppose the best way to think about this is sort of, right, category A's we're not using at all. Category B's, these are the ones that a lot of the milk contracts no longer want us to be using, and probably are very much second line, or we're having to have diagnostics in place to use. Category C is the next tier down, and there's a lot of products that people are routinely using that would sit in there, and similarly in category D. But in general, the approach should always be that actually, and I encourage people to take, is that just because a product is in category D doesn't mean we should just be using it willy-nilly. We have to be operating the same principles about responsible use, whichever category they fit into. It's just the sort of the layers on top of it that sort of impede the sort of vet's prescribing abilities. Mentioned there the high priority, critically important antibiotics. This is an area that's had a lot of attention over the last few years. These are ones that have been highlighted as being most important products for human health. They have the strictest conditions around their use, and realistically, they should be only used as that last resort. And we're now expected, certainly as vets, to provide evidence of why we're using them. So culture and sensitivity. So testing, demonstrating actually that the bacteria that we're testing are only sensitive to those. In the UK system, ones that we've been using on the dairy farms historically would be the fluoroquinolones and the third and fourth generation cephalosporins. So a lot of people have moved away from them now because of the expectations around that need for the further testing. And actually, when we look at the figures out there, the reports from the industry, we've made significant reductions in the use of these products on farm, and we haven't seen any changes in welfare or performance associated with that. So it's a good news story all round. So what are we looking at when we're, as vets, when we're choosing the correct antibiotic? There's a number of things that we're considering. We want to target the right bacteria, and because the antibiotics work in different ways, we need to make sure that they're going to be not affected by other things going on in the body, different modes of action, and how well a certain drug will get to the place we need it to. So not all drugs get to all parts of the body. So we have to be careful about, okay, well, actually, if I give this product, is it, and by injection, is it going to get into the udder? If I'm treating a calf with pneumonia, is the product going to concentrate in its lungs where I need it to be? So those are the things that we're looking at. And so that's the science that we're considering when we're making that prescribing decision. It's always about using the right drug for the right bug. And I think that's a key thing when we start looking and encouraging you to make best use of those antimicrobial reviews that you do with your vets, is going, right, these are the products I'm using. I'm currently using them for these conditions, and it's cross-checking that, making sure that they're the right ones, because actually using the wrong product in the wrong place, bad for AMR, bad for the industry in terms of that reputation and things like that. But actually it's not good for you or for the animal, because spending money on giving a product that's not going to get where it needs to be, false economy. So what are we talking about with antimicrobial resistance? It's a fact of life, and the best way, and I could spend hours going through and teaching you all about the nuances of how it develops and how it transmits. Best way to think about it is almost like Darwinism. So it's survival of the fittest. What we've got is a group of bacteria, and we're talking millions of a bacteria in any kind of infection. Within that population, there will be 1 or 2 mutants that potentially have a mutation that makes them resistant to the antibiotic. And when we then expose that population to the antibiotic, it confers them an advantage. It allows them to replicate. It kills all the other ones around them and allows them to multiply. So it is literally down to survival of the fittest. And the key thing and the key principles when we start considering what we're doing with antibiotics on farm is actually we need, for the treatment of the animal, to get sufficient antibiotic at the right concentration where the infection is. And if we fail to do that, that's when we're likely to see resistance. So underdosing, not finishing courses are going to be the big things that really cause that issue, or using a product that's not designed for the infection that we're treating. And AMR, it's been a focus of the industry for probably the last 10, 15, 20 years. It's really come to the fore, but we have to understand that it's an expected process. Because we're dealing with a living organism, resistance will always develop. We're dealing with an organism that mutates, becomes resistant, and limits the effectiveness of the antibiotics that we use. We therefore have a duty of care about them to make sure that actually we're not speeding up that process or actively driving it. And that's where we're looking to restrict use it in a targeted way, because the less we use them, the less likely we are to see resistance develop. And what you can see here on it, this is a graph that literally just shows the timeline of antibiotic sort of discovery over the years. And you can see the sort of penicillins were the first class that came along, 1928, and we started seeing resistance in 1940 to them. So it happens all the time. It sort of develops, and we see that for all the classes of antibiotics that we see being developed. Resistance will come after, almost as soon as you develop it, because it's just a naturally occurring process, and we just need to be doing things not to drive it. And actually, if you look back when to the Nobel Prize acceptance speech for the discovery of penicillin, he made explicit reference to prudent use and the risk of delivering risk of developing resistance. So it's been on the cards ever since antibiotics were discovered. And if we take it back into farming, what's the impact? Why are we concerned? We can say, well, actually, there's the national and sort of the wider scope in terms of the One Health. But if we develop AMR on farms, what's going to happen? Bacterial infections become harder to treat, becomes more costly to treat if we're using more expensive products, having to extend courses. Productivity could suffer. Welfare will be an issue in that stage. We could get to a stage where some farming systems could become unsustainable. So we would have to go to much more extensive systems because we just couldn't manage the infection pressure otherwise. There's a negative public image, and ultimately we're providing a product to the public in a lot of ways. We could see legislation just come in, so it could be a case that actually we see legislation restricting usage. We haven't gone down that line. We've seen industry guidelines coming through. We've seen the impact of milk purchasers, farm assurance schemes come in much quicker, but actually we're starting to see those guidelines already. And then, of course, there's going to be the risk around human health. So, as I said, we could focus on this as the whole talk, but what approach should we be taking on farm? And I think it's all about as little as possible, as much as necessary. I'm not going to stand here and preach and say, right, don't use antibiotics, full stop. It's about there will be a need for them. We will always see disease. And what it's about is going, right, we need to view these as precious commodities that we use in the right way. So identifying cases correctly, using the right product at the right time, and also taking other steps. And I think this is where, coming from with regards to looking at benchmarking, going, right, you have to provide a benchmarking report for your farm assurance, you're reviewing that. It's going, right, that gives you an idea of where your challenges are. Where are you currently using antimicrobials on your farm? There's a cost associated with that. It also reflects where the disease challenges are on farm. And what that then does is it highlights those areas that need attention or potential target areas for improvement. And what you can then do is work with your vets, with your advisors to turn around and say, right, what can we do about that? And that may be looking at how do we reduce the disease challenge in the first place. So changing management, looking at vaccination programs, looking about going, well, actually, if I'm not using very much antibiotics at the moment, in some ways, it goes back to being like a disease-free status. The biosecurity and not wanting to bring in diseases such as mycoplasma or things onto your farm suddenly become really important. So it all feels back into that sort of health planning approach. And when we do have to use them, it's making sure we're using them correctly. So following courses, completing courses, and for food safety, of course, observing withdrawal periods. So that kind of key aspects of antimicrobial stewardship can be summarized right. We look at reducing disease, so biosecurity, use of vaccines, good management and husbandry, correct use of medicine, so right product at the right time, right dose administered in the correct manner for the right condition. And when you're doing your benchmarking and you're looking through your records for your medicines, it becomes very apparent what you've used over the last year. And it's so you go, well, actually, you've used a lot of this, but hang on a minute, we should be using it in this way. And as you start seeing errors always do creep in on farm in terms of, especially we've got larger teams where people using the wrong product, they're using the wrong dose, or they're extending courses unnecessarily. And it's a chance to review it when you benchmark and start going, okay, that's an area I need to look at. We need to avoid using routine prophylaxis. So avoid using antibiotics as standard management. And I think we've seen a lot of progress on that in terms of the sort of move away from blanket antibiotic dry cow therapy. And then we sort of see, this is the focus of today, it's looking a bit more about that quality data recording. Understanding what is used where, it's the same as you recording disease. It gives us a way of understanding your system. And when you look at technology, you look at vaccines, you can understand where to invest in the farm, take time, or what changes need to be made to improve the system. So with antimicrobial benchmark, what are we looking at? We're looking at referring to the sort of comparison of a farm's antibiotic usage with other farms in a regional country. Could be within your vet practice, could be in a producer group. It could be as simple as looking at yourself and literally comparing year on year. And what are the benefits? It allows you to understand your antibiotic use, how it's changed over the time, gives you some context relative to the industry in terms of your performance. I always view it as it stimulates a conversation, and it should encourage those persistently high using farms to look at management practices and make changes. But similarly, for those that are performing really well, it's a great way of us sort of going, right, okay, how do we make ourselves even better and make ourselves even more economically viable? Or how do we make other changes? Or what do we do to maintain our status? And I've put it in brackets at the end because it is required as part of farm assurance schemes and retailer schemes. But I think it should be viewed not as the, right, that's not the only reason for doing it. In some ways, it's best practice to be doing it, and you can get a lot of information of it. And by doing it, you then tick a box of that requirement. Don't view it that it's just that paper exercise that you need to do once a year to satisfy the needs of people. Because actually, you should view it as a very good way of understanding your system. So if we look at where we're at overall within the industry, this graph here is from the VMD reports. They publish veterinary sales data once a year. We're still waiting for last year's figures, but this has sort of that demonstrates what's gone on in terms of sales across the industry. This we've seen drops in the overall usage year on year since 2015, and we talk about this sort of benchmarking really driving down, and sort of this benchmark gives an overview of what the industry is doing. And if we look at that within focusing on specific high priority, critically important antibiotics, so those ones that we said, right, these are the ones that we're really stepping away from, we've seen huge drops. So if we look at what's gone on over the last 4 or 5 years, 60% sort of, and just on fluoroquinolones, about 74% drop across all categories. So massive inlays into sort of us making improvements in the system, and great news stories for the industry. And this hasn't been associated with challenges in terms of how systems are performing on the ground or welfare issues. So on those figures, and we'll talk a bit this more as we go into the benchmarking reports, everyone talks about milligrams per kilogram, and it's a sort of, and that's milligrams per kilogram per PCU. And so PCU, as I say, is a population corrected unit. It's a way of us sort of going, right, how do I compare one farm to another? And it's going, right, it's basically giving, right, what's the average weight of an animal at any stage of its life on that farm when it gets treated. So we can easily total up the sales data. So your vets can help you on that. Certainly, right, what have you purchased over the year? They will then sort of go, right, and the number of animals, and those number of animals we then times by the average weight of those animals. Dairy cows, just for reference, the standardized weight for a dairy cow is 425 kilos. And I know before anyone says it, that's a low weight. So I know that most of your cattle will be well above that. But what they're doing is they're factoring in the average weight of that animal as it grows on farm as well. So effectively, it's taking it across its lifetime. So it factors in calves and everything else. So that's why it's done at a slightly lower figure. So all they're doing is saying, right, you've used X number of milligrams of an antibiotic, and you have X number of cows at 425 kilos, divide one by the other, and that gives you a figure of what your overall usage is. A lot of you will be aware of the Rumour Targets Task Force, and this was a sort of an industry initiative. Initial report in 2017 laid out some industry targets, and I think that's where a lot of schemes are working to. We've seen a lot of good publicity and a lot of great actions come out of this, with this sort of driving where the industry needs to get to. So they set out some targets about how they wanted to see the use of high priority critically important injectables, intramammaries drop over the time. So set out targets for 2020. Also looking at drops in intramammary tubes and an increase in use of teat sealants. and that drop of overall usage down to like 21 milligrams per kilogram. So they put a line in the sand of where they wanted to see, on average, the industry sit. We're now a few years on. Update from the report in October 2019. What we've seen is actually we've made significant improvements towards those targets. We've seen dry cow tube usage, so antibiotic dry cow tube usage begin to drop off. We've seen reduction in intramammary tubes. Total usage across farm is actually below where the target was for 2020, which is great. We're seeing a slight increase in this teat sealant usage, and with that, this drive towards selective dry cow therapy. And I think there's a lot of initiatives coming in over the next couple of years to really drive that even further and look at how that can be further. So we're making some great steps on that in terms of improvement. And I suppose, right, that's what the industry is doing. We've got some great news stories out that the overall industry is doing well. There's still a way to go, and there's a lot of initiatives coming up. We're going to start seeing more centralized recording with online medicine recording, but great place to be in. And but I wanted to do is take it and go, right, what are we doing with benchmarking and how does it relate to individual farms? Because some of those figures just go, right, well, actually, that's a target for the industry. Where does it sit with me and my farm, and what's the benefit to me? And as I said, what are we trying to do? What do I want to do by benchmarking? And I could do this based on any kind of performance data. If I just look through disease incidence or weight gains and things like that, we're understanding the performance of a farm. But if we look specifically at the benchmarking of antimicrobials, what we're trying to do is understand specific disease challenges on the farms. We want to highlight areas for improvement. I think what it does is aids discussions of treatment protocols. So a lot of farms now, I think the relationship has changed with the vet over the last 20 years. The vets are often much more involved in sort of setting protocols for the team to use for a lot of that preliminary sort of sick cow work. And it's making sure that actually those get reviewed. Are they effective? Are they achieving the results that people want? And making sure they're doing what they're supposed to do. We want to understand the veterinary medicine spend. And I think as I say, we're always interested to understand performance relative to similar enterprises. And I think that can help certainly within your local areas or groups of people doing a similar kind of job. So in terms of similar levels of production or similar systems in terms of grazing versus slightly more intensive, just like, well, where do you sit? What's achievable? And I think it just puts everything into context. And again, meets requirements of assurance schemes, but hopefully those 5 points at the top are enough of a carrot for you to see the benefit of it, rather than it being based about just a paper exercise to meet assurance standards. So here's an example of one of the reporting systems we use. So this is something within our business, like Kingshay, that actually presents data, takes sales data from the farm, so it's taken directly from the vet practice that supplies them, breaks it down into different areas and allows people to have a look at it and go, right, how am I doing? Where do I sit in relation to other people? Highlights different classes of product use, looks at where the potential areas of concern are, looks at how you can then provide a really nice way of facilitating discussion, all done automatically. So actually it's very easy, no one's sitting there going through a medicines book, plotting everything up and then having to do the maths. It just allows it to come out in a report like this that then allows you to focus on what does the information tell me, rather than actually spending the time just pulling the data together. So if we look through it in specific areas, there's an opportunity to consider benchmarking. And again, as I say, benchmarking can be against others. So this where we've got produce a group of 306 farms, comparison that. what it allows people to do is say, right, where do I sit? Example there is sitting ranked 194, and you can see the massive spread that we still see. So even in light of where we're sitting as an industry currently, with those figures being reported of us actually, right, we're hitting those targets that the task force set out, we still see that there are some farms that are 5 times higher than that target. And those farms, you can imagine, if they're using products at that, that's a massive economic spend for them. There's an element of health and welfare issues on that, and you wonder what the impact is on productivity. So it is the case of, we've got some great news for the industry, but actually as an individual, there's work to be done to make sure that actually this is still on the agenda. This still needs to be top there as one of the things that you're reviewing, to ensure that health and productivity are at the absolute optimum on your farm. Same way, you can just literally benchmark against yourself. So what did you do last year versus this year? And this farm, you can see, made significant improvements over the space of 12 months and had a 20% reduction in its usage. So it's quite a nice thing for teams to be able to see, right, okay, we did this last year. And if you imagine, if we start making changes on farm, changes in buildings, vaccination programs, disease eradication programs, it's a quick and easy way of you actually being able to see, right, what is the impact of that? We're always sort of bringing vaccines to the fore, changes in management of things. Actually, this is a great way of you seeing, right, if we are truly controlling these diseases, what is the impact on my farm in terms of reduction in usage? So we can see that, we can instantly see that and demonstrate it alongside the sort of that improvement. We can break it down to how people are using it. Ultimately, you can say, right, is it dry cow tubes, lactating tubes, injectables, or others? And what this allows you to think about is going, right, it's no longer just, right, my total antibiotics. It's like, right, where am I using my products? Dry cow tubes. It's like, right, is that an area that I'm still using high usage? Is there more of an opportunity that I could be doing more with selective dry cow therapy? And that you can then drives you down that conversation about, right, let's have a look at where your cutoffs are for choosing selective dry cow therapy. Are we happy with our dry cow dry period cure rates? We can then look at lactating cow tubes, and that's a direct, ultimately, surrogate for mastitis. But even then, it drives a conversation. How many tubes are you using per case? What's your recurrence rate? Because all of that will contribute to higher usage. So it allows you to be, right, we're suddenly going from, right, that conversation with the vet and just going, right, what's the general performance? I've suddenly, just through looking at a few graphs, really driven some key areas that you go, right, we could look here and go, right, dry cow tube usage, we want to bring that down. I want to spend less money on that. We know, having looked at other figures, that actually our dry period cure rate is good. What's the opportunity? Lactating cow tubes, hang on a minute. We thought our caseload, we've got a good case rate in terms of mastitis cases, but we're still using a lot of antibiotics. What are we doing in terms of long courses? What are our repeat courses like? And then similarly for injectables, what's going on there? Is there issues with fresh cow health? Are we seeing a lot of uterine infections post-calving? What's the opportunities? And the others in there, just as a way of sort of thinking about the other products. And the classic one we see driving really high usage on farm was antibiotic foot baths. So that's a very heavy usage format. It's just like, actually, that using an antibiotic foot bath uses a huge amount of antibiotics relative to the number of animals on farm. So it can be a significant contributor to your overall usage. We alluded to earlier, there's a sort of breakdown of different classes. And I think looking through your benchmarking allows you to go, right, this is the easy graph, these kind of reports or these conversations with your vet go, right, what am I using in specific classes? We highlighted here those cephalosporins and fluoroquinolones, those high priority ones. Right, we either had some there or we're not using them now. Or it really allows you to go, right, what are you using? Either, if you're not using at all, demonstrates that they're not being used, so great reports to share with people, or it goes, right, we are still using them. What's the alternative? It's the discussion about what is my alternative to using those products. Other classes, it then just allows it promoting that conversation about, right, what are you using these specific products for? And especially in the situation where we've seen over the last couple of years, where there is a lot of changes with the drugs available on farm. We have seen, as an industry, so many out of stock issues with mastitis tubes, intramammary therapies, and even some of the injectables. I think we need to be very careful that teams and everyone's aware of, right, what are we using? Are we using the right product still? Because so many changes have been made because, all right, this product's not, we haven't had access to it because of manufacturing issues, or we've switched to a product. There's been so many changes that making sure you're reviewing your medicines is going to be really important to go, right, actually, am I using the right product, the right dose, at the right time for the right condition? Or is there an alternative? And then that goes even further. We go into an individual breakdown by product. And I tell you what, sometimes when you start doing it by this, you start going, hang on a minute, it's surprising how much of specific products I buy. And you go, right, well, actually, when you're presented with, right, that's 20, 30 bottles over the course of a year, it's you start thinking, right, what am I using that for? What am I using for? And what are the steps I could take to reduce that? And it puts a cost out there. You go, well, actually, if I know that a bottle of that costs me X and I've used 20 or 30 bottles of it, suddenly taking some steps to reduce that, the cost benefit becomes really apparent. Promotes that discussion about how they're being used. And I think that's one of the key things for me is going, right, this is a great way of just going, it's not just about, all right, I think I've got a problem with this disease. It's just like, okay, you think you've got a problem with this disease, but you're using a lot of antibiotics. What are they being used for? What's the target there? Identifies alternatives. As I said before, specific disease issues, it sort of drives conversations. I think it allows you to target for improvements. And again, we're back to that situation where breaking it down gives you what the data you need for the audit, but don't view it just as a paper exercise. There is so much information here that can promote truly useful conversation that is good for the industry, but actually is good for your business as well. So, conscious of time, wanted to wrap up so that we have some chance for conversations. Hopefully, we've gone over a very sort of whistle-stop tour of some of the medicines and antimicrobial units. Quick touch on where we are with the industry and the sort of current updates, but then hopefully sort of giving you a real example of, right, actually, this is not just about the industry. This is about what I do on my day-to-day business and how it can benefit my farm. So at that stage, I will wrap up there. And yeah, I'm happy to take any questions.
Tim, thank you for that. You've covered all the angles there. I think it's really interesting and, you know, great to see where those targets were set and where we're coming down to. Question here is, how do you reach some of those hard to reach farmers, as in the lower 25%, as we usually sort of refer to them as, who really aren't looking at data, they're not looking at figures. You know, they're in their comfort zone of what they've done all the time, and they're very hard to change their confidence, really. But how do you approach those kind of farmers?
So, and it's a really good question. I think some of it's coming through, we're seeing it with the farm assurance, and you know what, people are forcing it to the fore in terms of the expectations of what those people are wanting to do. I think everyone's always about data on farm, and I think sometimes people get frightened by it, about recording and things like that. All that I presented here is literally, this is pulled off vet system. This is sales data, and you know what? And I say this to my vets, it's an easy way of us approaching this kind of topic. I'm not reliant on what someone's done on farm. You know what, there will be, there's always issues about how people record it or errors creep in, but actually the vets have got a vested interest in recording their sales. The farmers have a vested interest in it because it covers what they're spending. And actually for some of those people, this is a great starting point for going, okay, look, this is what it's costing you. But it's always about, how do we reach out to those people and it's finding the hook for them, and I think that's the challenge, because I think that group of people aren't probably going to be driven by the industry initiatives, but it may be a case that actually, if I can go with, this is what you've spent on these antibiotics, this is the cost of it, what do we do about how do we change it, and actually breaking it down into some quite small, easy reach things. And you know what, even if we just having a conversation with them about, right, switching from one product to another, it's a sort of, right, that's a step in the right direction.
I think you're right. I think the hook being money is usually the best one to go for. But sometimes, you know, some of those people are in such rural areas are not really covered by, say, large animal vets who are following all this. It's, you know, more likely to be a mixed animal practice. Is that holding those people back, do you think, or?
It shouldn't do, and I think in some ways actually there are tools out there in terms of offering the sort of free benchmarking tools that sort of they can have access, or they can if it's a question of them not getting that from their vets, you know what, it's signposting. The AHDB's got some great resources already out there that actually you can go, right, these are online things that you can put your own data into. So actually there's an opportunity there, sort of you can get similar results or get at least some of that benchmarking there. And I think it's about having that conversation.
Yeah, no, definitely. What about going forward then, you know, sort of improvements? We went for the low hanging fruit, for the best expression. Where are we going to get those improvements in these, reducing these targets going forward? And, you know, are we going to lose momentum because the improvements will be so small, but they'll be incrementally still incredibly important?
It's a great question, Diane, and I think this is going to be the challenge. And you see that from the figures that the sort of from the Rumour Target Task Force come out. It's like, right, we've made this huge drop down, and I think that's always very rewarding. And I think we're not going to get that again. Like, it's to say, as you say, we've got the low hanging fruit. That's probably there's some aspects there about, right, these are raising the bar a little bit, ensuring that we're focusing on this as a topic. The next steps are going to be the bit harder. They're the slower burn. This is where we're going to be like, right, it is disease eradication programs. It's what we're doing already with things like BVD eradications. They all feed into it, but it's just like, right, I can't eradicate BVD overnight, so it's going to take a lot longer, rather than, well, actually, I ban fluoroquinolones or people say we're not going to use them, that's an instant, right, it suddenly stops. So I think you're right, we're going to start seeing, we're not going to get the big rewards in terms of those figures, but we also have to bear in mind, we're not saying that we want to get down to zero. And I think that's the thing that we have to be clear as an industry, is going, right, what are we happy with? What is a appropriate level that is correct for the standard of welfare and health that we want on our farms? Because if we're chasing zero, we're going to get disappointed. And actually we need to make sure that actually we as an industry, and I think that's where the Target Task Force is very good, and it's taking steps. We need to understand, decide, right, what do we want to be at? Because at that point we then, and as long as at that point we're demonstrating that we are doing everything correctly, and actually welfare's good, the performance is where we need it to be, and health is good, that's what we need to be at. If we're constantly chasing zero, it's a bad news story, because actually you get to a stage where suddenly we're setting targets that are unrealistic, as you say, everyone gets disappointed, and it becomes a bad news story. It's like, oh, we're trying to get down to zero. We're never going to get down to zero.
No. You've just stolen my next question, Tim, which was about this, you know, your thoughts on the zero contracts. And I know when we were on the Targets Task Force, we were very much talking about, you know, removing competitive advantage. And actually, we don't want to get to zero contracts. And that was a really dangerous place to be. I mean, I don't know what your thoughts are on, you know, where we take that forward. And
it's a really difficult one, because you need that crystal ball. We're dealing with living systems. And I see this with all the units I benchmark on, be it for health or be it for or antimicrobial usage. You can have a good year, you can have a bad year. There's always going to be, suddenly we turn around and say, right, just because your antimicrobial usage jumped up over 1 year because you had an unfortunate outbreak of disease, does that mean you're doing a bad job? No, and I think that's what we need to factor into whatever we do forward. It can't be viewed in isolation. And I think that's where probably the real mainstay of this talk has been about going, right, don't just view it on its own. View it as a catalyst for talking about disease control, disease prevention, because otherwise, if it all becomes about, right, us demonstrating that we're below a certain level, well, actually, what's the human behavior is then, right, fine, I don't buy it, I hide recording of it, or we then end up in a situation where we compromise integrity, we compromise welfare. And I think that's where we have to be really careful that we're taking a joined up approach. And in some ways, that's where I think when you start looking at the targets and it's going, right, it's not just about getting down to this level, it's encouraging behaviors around it. It's about, right, what am I doing for vaccination? Because if we say, right, we're doing all we can to reduce this disease like calf pneumonia, you know what, there will still be cases that need treatment. But if we've done everything we possibly can to reduce the reliance on antibiotics, then I think we can hold our heads up high.
It's all about responsible use, isn't it, at the end of the day?
Yeah.
And you know, we shouldn't be beating ourselves up. You know, if you do need the drugs, they need to be there, but only use them responsibly. And it's interesting. I mean, just go back to the King's Hay graphs that you put up. You know, some comments how good they are because they're so visual. And I think I agree. I mean, when you start looking at benchmarking yourself on that whole run through against your group, etc., it really does bring home where you are on the curve, doesn't it? And encourages you, you know, to take it forward. So what about futures then? What about the next lot of technology that's coming down the line, the next new inventions, the diagnostics, everything else? What's coming down the line that we're going to see?
So I suppose if we're not going to see new antibiotics, I think that's one of the things to say. It was almost, you saw that the graph there I said about the production pipeline, the antibiotics and discoveries. You know what, we haven't seen new molecules in the last 20 or so years, and even if there are new ones coming forward, they aren't coming to us on farm. So we cannot be reliant on new products coming in. Where are the focuses? And I think everyone's aware of it, and probably you'll see over the next sort of few days, couple of weeks in terms of the presentations. A lot of the technology, where is it focused? About disease prevention. So yeah, we see there's an increased interest in sort of vaccination, and that's a big drive. And you know what, it's always on the sort of tip of everyone's tongue at the moment, given the current circumstances that we find ourselves in. But people can therefore see where the advantages come from it. There's a lot of this is about accurate identification. And I think the real focus is we are still at the reliance of, in some ways, best guess about what's the right product to use at the right time. You know what, we've got a lot of the things that we see on Star Trek, but you know what, we don't have the medical tricorder or whatever it is that turns around and tells it exactly what the infection is at the time we're going to use the drug. And I think that's where the real interest is at the moment. There's going, right, how do I look at this animal, test the milk, test or whatever, and go, right, this is going to be the right product. We've started seeing it. So we're seeing some farms do on-farm cultures and something that are driving it almost to the point where we're getting a bit better of that understanding. So that focus on that just actually being able to be really targeted. And again, the other thing is the early disease detection, being able to go, right, if I pick up a cow a day earlier and I put in place therapy, oral fluid therapy, pain relief, something that's going to stop it in the same way as that, what do we do? When I'm sick, the first thing I do is I will rest up a bit. I might drink a bit more in terms of fluids. I may have some ibuprofen or something I don't carry antibiotics in my medicine cabinet at home. They're only released to me after I get to a certain point and go to the doctors. And I think it's about us going, right, we need to get to a stage where we are happy and that we can use technology to really identify disease in the early stages.
I think one of the most exciting things I've seen in the last 5 years is that absolute step change in that vet-farmer relationship. And I know it doesn't work for everybody, and I know it hasn't happened for everybody, but I think there has been a real change there in terms of planning and, you know, being more open to looking at things. And I think farmers slowly have got the confidence and are talking about these subjects, and that will actually then lead to them having, you know, a lot stronger conversations as well. And you know, you can't take it all on board overnight, can you? So it's is about building on that. I have got a question here from Janice that's just come through, and she's asking, how much scope do you find there is to reduce on-farm antibiotic use with on-farm bacteriology testing?
So I think it's not necessarily on-farm bacteriology testing. What's it going to let us do? In that's less about us probably having a massive reduction in it, because at the end of the day, all we're doing is that bit bacteriology is just us allowing us to understand better what the bacteria is. It allows us to be more focused. So we will see a reduction, because what it does is allows it going, right, if I'm reaching for a medicine, I'm sure I'm going to be using the right one. So I avoid using the wrong one and then using this one and then having to go switch over to this one at the second stage, or avoiding some of the chronic cases. But it's not going to be the massive sort of sudden fall, but it's about being very targeted. But the diagnostics, the other thing we see it with calf scour or things like a diagnostic that allows me to tell, is this a virus or a bacteria, that has a bigger impact on it, because I'm not covering the virus cases with an antibiotic, because I don't need to. It's going, right, that's the focus on fluid therapy or us looking at other preventative structures. So it will help, but it's not going to see a massive reduction. That would be a long-term burden, because it just means that you're going to be making better use of the products you are using.
Mm-hmm. One final question come through, and that's about where are we in the world, and are we able to use the achievements we've made in terms of trade, for example?
I think we've made significant headway into this, and I think we are well respected across the world about this. There are other countries in Europe that have taken much more stricter approaches to the medicines, and I think there's an aspect, and that was always the concern sometimes when we talked about the sort of the European medicines and stuff like that, was going, right, are we going to see regulations like some of the Scandinavian countries where actually it's done purely by the vet? So you go, right, we just take it all off the farm and you have to have a vet involved to do it. Absolutely. I think there is an opportunity there for us to be really almost be shouting about it, going, look, and actually this boils into a lot of different things, because it's about the responsible use of antimicrobials, but it's also about, right, adherence to withdrawal periods. It's all the kind of, these products impact on trade and health in so many different ways, and actually it's the integrated thing. It's just like, you know what, if we eradicate BVD, if we eradicate other diseases, it's all part of the same picture.
Brilliant. Tim, that's been so interesting. I've come to the end of my questions there, so thank you very much for that and covering all the angles. Once again, thank you to our sponsors.